I never thought my life would feel so flat. Not that I was expecting fireworks every day, but when did I become a supporting actor in the story of my own existence? My name is Matthew Collins, and I'm 48 years old. On the surface, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. I've got a stable career as a senior software engineer, a suburban home with a white picket fence, and 2 teenagers, Ethan and Grace. If someone looked at my life from the outside, they'd probably think I was living the dream. But that's the thing about dreams. They have a way of turning into routines, and routines can choke the life out of you if you let them. My days begin with a cold, monotonous rhythm. The alarm clock blares at precisely 6:15 a.m. I've stopped questioning why I still set it so early. It's not like there's a reason to rush anymore. My job, which once ignited something like ambition in me, has become a hamster wheel of deadlines, meetings, and glitches. I fix problems I stopped caring about years ago, all while pretending to find meaning in the grind. Then there's Sarah, my wife. Our marriage wasn't always like this. There was a time when laughter filled the corners of our home. We shared inside jokes, stayed up late planning for our future, and leaned on each other when the world felt heavy. But now, we coexist in a fog of polite indifference. We move through our home like ghosts, careful not to disrupt the fragile peace we've created. Even when we're in the same room, there's an unbridgeable distance between us. Sarah often retreats to our bedroom early, citing exhaustion or headaches. I let her go. I don't even try anymore. Dinner conversations with the kids are equally strained. Ethan, at 17, has become a stranger. Angry, defiant, always on his phone or storming out to meet friends I don't approve of. Grace, at 14, is quieter, but her silence is just as troubling. She's either holed up in her room or glued to her group chats, her responses to me clipped and distant. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I thought I was building something solid, a family, a future, a life worth remembering. But somewhere along the line, I lost control of the narrative. I don't even know when it started to unravel. Maybe it was when the kids hit their teen years, or when Sarah and I stopped making time for each other. Or maybe it was when I buried my own dreams in the name of stability. Ah, my dreams. They still linger in the background, whispering at the edges of my mind. I wanted to be a writer once. There's even a folder on my laptop. Untold Stories, it's called, filled with the skeletons of novels I never had the courage or time to finish. I tell myself I'll get back to them someday, but that day never comes. If I'm honest, though, the cracks in my life aren't just in my marriage or my kids. They're in me. I've become someone I barely recognize. A man who settles for comfort over passion, who avoids confrontation at all costs, and who drifts through each day hoping tomorrow will somehow be different. But nothing changes if you don't change it, and deep down, I know that. Something has to give. I can't keep going like this, suffocating under the weight of a life that feels more like an obligation than a choice. But where do you even start when everything feels like it's crumbling? You don't. You wait. You endure. At least that's what I tell myself. Until the day I can't anymore. This is the story of how my life fell apart and, strangely, how that falling apart became the best thing that ever happened to me. But we'll get to that. For now, let's just say that when I woke up this morning, I had no idea that the cracks I'd been ignoring were about to split wide open. It started out like any other Tuesday, mundane, gray, and forgettable. The kind of day that blends into all the others until you can't tell where one ends and the next begins. My alarm went off at 6:15 a.m. The coffee was too bitter, and the commute felt like an endless crawl through molasses. By the time I got to the office, a dull ache had settled behind my eyes. A nagging throb I dismissed as another symptom of the stress I'd stopped acknowledging long ago. I didn't expect to be sent home. My boss, a man whose patience for sick days was about as generous as his sense of humor, took one look at me and said, "You look terrible, Collins. Go home before you infect the rest of us." I didn't argue. The ache behind my eyes had turned into a pounding headache, and all I wanted was to crawl into bed and sleep off the nausea. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed it immediately. The green pickup truck. It wasn't familiar, but I told myself it might belong to a delivery person or a contractor. Still, unease coiled in my stomach. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the truck seemed so boldly parked, as if daring me to ask why it was there. The house was too quiet when I stepped inside. You get used to the rhythms of a home, the sounds that make it feel alive, the hum of the TV, the clink of dishes, the distant murmur of voices. But today, the silence was oppressive. It hung in the air like a warning. I kicked off my shoes and made my way toward the stairs, trying to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Her laughter. It was light, melodic, and painfully familiar. The kind of laugh that used to belong only to me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe she'd invited a friend over. But deep down, I already knew the truth. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, carrying me up the stairs, step by hesitant step. The bedroom door was ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of the bed. And then I saw them. Sarah, my wife of 20 years, and a man I didn't recognize, entwined, laughing, whispering. Time stopped. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of an invisible force. I wanted to burst into the room, to yell, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there, frozen in the doorway of a life I no longer recognized. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. My breath was shallow, my head spinning, but some strange, detached part of me insisted I needed proof. Proof that this wasn't some fever dream brought on by exhaustion and a bad night's sleep. I took a photo, and then another. Each click of the shutter felt like a dagger to my chest. Her laughter floated through the air, mocking me, cutting deeper than I thought possible. When I had enough, I backed away, careful not to let the door creak. I didn't want her to know I'd been there. Not yet. I don't remember walking down the stairs or stepping outside. The cold winter air hit me like a slap, but even that didn't feel real. My car was waiting, a refuge I didn't deserve. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as though it could anchor me to something solid. The green pickup truck was still there, bold and unbothered. I stared at it, my breath fogging up the windshield. For a moment, all I could think about was how everything I thought I knew had been upended in an instant. My marriage, my home, my life. I'd always imagined that if something like this happened, I'd scream, throw things, demand answers. But there was no screaming, no breaking of dishes. Just silence, deafening, suffocating silence. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a single thought took root. This is the moment everything changes. I don't remember how long I sat in the car, staring at that green pickup truck. 5 minutes? An hour? Time had lost all meaning. My hands were trembling, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached, but my mind was unnervingly calm. Too calm. It was the kind of calm that follows the storm, the eye of the hurricane before the real destruction begins. There it was, bold as brass, sitting in my driveway like it belonged there. That damn truck, a blatant symbol of everything I'd just seen. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as I imagined the smug bastard who drove it. He was still inside my house, still laughing with my wife, still lying on the bed where I'd slept for 20 years. My bed. Our bed. The air in the car felt stifling, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't sit there any longer. I needed to move, to do something, anything, to reclaim a sliver of control in a moment where I felt completely powerless. I stepped out into the cold, the winter air biting against my flushed skin. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked to the back of my car and opened the trunk. The toolkit was right where it always was, tucked neatly in the corner, waiting for emergencies. Well, this felt like an emergency. Not in the traditional sense, but it would do. I crouched down by the front tire of the pickup, unscrewing the valve cap with methodical precision. The hiss of escaping air was almost therapeutic, like the truck itself was deflating under the weight of my anger. One tire wasn't enough. I moved to the next, then the next, and finally the fourth. Each tire sank lower, leaving the truck helpless and grounded. It wasn't justice, not by a long shot, but it was something. A small act of defiance in a situation where I felt completely powerless. When I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. Let him figure out how to explain this later. Let him call a tow truck in the freezing cold. Let him feel even a fraction of the inconvenience he'd brought into my life. I got back into my car, the tension in my chest easing slightly. It wasn't enough, of course. A few deflated tires weren't going to fix what I'd seen or erase the images seared into my memory. But it was a start. A way to remind myself that I wasn't entirely powerless. Driving away from the house, I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing it, the home I'd worked so hard to build, made my stomach turn. That house wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to someone else now, someone who thought they could laugh in the face of everything I'd built and walk away unscathed. I pulled into the parking lot of a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting a harsh glow against the dark sky. It wasn't much, but it would do. I needed space. Space to think. Space to plan. Space to figure out what came next. The room was as bleak as I felt. Sterile white walls, a single lamp that flickered when I turned it on, and a bed that looked like it hadn't been comfortable in decades. I tossed my duffel bag onto the bed and sank heavily into the chair by the desk. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Sarah's name lit up the screen, her calls coming in one after the other. I didn't answer. I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I opened the photo gallery on my phone and stared at the images I'd taken. Proof. Cold, hard proof of what I'd seen. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep looking. Each photo was a reminder of the betrayal, the lies, the mockery of everything I thought we had. Then an idea struck me, not out of anger, but out of sheer necessity. I wasn't going to yell or scream or make a scene. That would be too easy, too predictable. No, I was going to be smart about this. Calculated. I searched through the truck's insurance card, glimpsed through its windshield before I left. One name stood out. Mark Davis. A quick online search pulled up a LinkedIn profile and, better yet, a Facebook account. His wife's name was easy to find, Jessica Davis, and within moments, I had her email address. The message I sent was short, anonymous, detached. I attached the clearest photos I had taken and wrote, "You deserve to know the truth. Your husband was with my wife today. These photos speak for themselves." Before I could overthink it, I hit send. The message disappeared into the void, and I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't closure. But it was a start. If Mark thought he could waltz into my life and walk away unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. I stared at the screen for a while, the silence in the room pressing in around me. My chest still ached, my head still spun, but for the first time since I walked into that house, I felt the faintest flicker of control. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. For now. The next day, I returned to the house. I didn't rush. There was no point. I knew exactly what I was walking into, and the thought filled me with equal parts dread and cold determination. My goal was simple: pack my things, walk out the door, and leave the wreckage behind. As I parked the car in the driveway, the sight of the house hit me differently this time. It didn't feel like home anymore. The place where I'd shared 2 decades of my life with Sarah and raised Ethan and Grace now felt foreign, like a stage where all the props had been rearranged. I stepped inside, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. I hadn't even made it past the entryway when I heard her voice. "Matthew," Sarah called from the living room. Her tone was quiet, hesitant. "We need to talk." I ignored her. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew how these conversations went. The pleading, the excuses, the half-truths. It was a script I wasn't willing to follow. Instead, I headed straight for the stairs, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. "Matthew," she said again, louder this time. I could hear her scrambling to follow me, her desperation palpable. "Please, just talk to me." By the time I reached the bedroom, she was standing in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice cracking as she saw me pulling out a suitcase and throwing clothes into it. "What I should have done a long time ago," I replied, my tone calm but resolute. My hands moved methodically, packing only the essentials. I wasn't in the mood for sentimentality. She stepped closer, her voice rising. "You can't just leave like this. We can work through this, Matthew. It was a mistake." I cut her off, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. "A mistake?" I said, turning to face her. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or leaving the stove on. 6 months of lies, Sarah? That's not a mistake. That's a choice." Her face crumpled at my words, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was lonely, Matthew," she said, her voice trembling. "You were so distant. We stopped talking, stopped connecting. I didn't know what to do." "And your solution was to crawl into someone else's bed?" I shot back, my voice sharp and unrelenting. "Did you think that would fix us? Did you even think about what it would do to me? To the kids?" She flinched at that, her sobs growing louder. "I know I messed up, okay? But I love you, Matthew. I don't want to lose you. Please, let's fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, my jaw tightening as I forced myself to stay composed. "You don't destroy the people you love, Sarah. You don't humiliate them, break their trust, and then beg for forgiveness when you get caught." Her shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. "I was scared," she whispered between sobs. "Scared of losing you. Scared of waking up one day and realizing you didn't love me anymore." I felt a pang of something. Sympathy? Regret? I wasn't sure. But it didn't change anything. "You didn't lose me, Sarah. You threw me away." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I stood there, watching the woman I'd shared so much of my life with fall apart. And then I turned back to my suitcase, zipping it shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah was there again, blocking the door. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, Matthew," she said, her hands trembling. "Don't do this." I met her gaze, my expression cold and resolute. "You already did." And with that, I stepped past her, the sound of the door closing behind me punctuating the finality of it all. As I walked to my car, I didn't look back. The house stood there, a monument to a life that no longer belonged to me. My suitcase felt heavy in my hand, but it was nothing compared to the weight I'd carried in that house for far too long. The winter air stung my face as I slid into the driver's seat, but for the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not yet, but relief. The kind that comes from knowing you've made the right choice, even when it's the hardest one. This wasn't the end. Not really. It was just the beginning of something new. What that something was, I wasn't sure yet. But as I drove away from the house that had once been my home, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back. Not ever. Leaving Sarah was one thing. facing Ethan and Grace. That was another beast entirely. I'd braced myself for their reactions, knowing full well they'd each have their own way of processing this mess. What I hadn't anticipated was just how deeply their emotions would cut through me. Ethan stormed into my motel room 2 days after I left. I hadn't told them where I was staying, but Sarah must have. I was sitting at the small table, sorting through paperwork I'd brought with me, when the door flung open, slamming against the wall with a force that rattled the framed mirror above the bed. "So, that's it?" Ethan said, his voice dripping with contempt. He stood there, fists clenched, his face red with anger. "You're just walking out on us?" I set down the papers and turned to face him, doing my best to remain calm. "I'm not walking out on you," I said evenly. "I'm making a choice for myself." Ethan laughed bitterly, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "A choice for yourself? That's rich, Dad. Real noble. Just leave Mom to pick up the pieces while you play the victim. Do you even care about what this is doing to us? To me? To Grace?" His words hit like a punch to the gut, but I kept my tone steady. "This isn't about playing the victim, Ethan. It's about respecting myself enough to walk away from something that's broken." "Respecting yourself?" He shot back, his voice rising. "How about respecting us? You think this is hard for you? Try being the kid whose dad bails because he can't handle it." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay composed. "I didn't bail, Ethan, and don't you dare put this all on me. I didn't create this situation, but I'm not going to stay and pretend it's okay. That wouldn't help any of us." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head as he turned toward the door. "You're just running away. Typical." Before I could respond, he slammed the door behind him, the sound reverberating through the tiny room. I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door, his words echoing in my mind. I'd known he would be angry, but hearing the disappointment in his voice was harder than I'd expected. Later that evening, there was another knock at the door. Softer this time. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of who or what I'd be facing next. When I opened the door, Grace stood there, her shoulders hunched, her eyes red from crying. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, and she walked in, sitting on the edge of the bed and fidgeting with the hem of her sweatshirt. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and neither did I. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. "Dad," she began finally, her voice trembling. "Please don't leave us." Her words shattered something inside me. I sat down beside her, careful to keep my voice gentle. "Grace, this isn't about leaving you or Ethan. I'll always be your dad." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It feels like you're giving up on us, on me. I know things have been bad, but I don't want to lose you." I reached out, placing a hand on hers. "You're not losing me, Grace. This decision isn't about you or your brother. It's about me and your mom. But no matter where I go, I'm always going to be here for you. You'll always be my daughter." She sniffled, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "Promise?" "I promise," I said, my voice firm but kind. For the first time in days, I saw a glimmer of hope in her tearful eyes. It was fragile, but it was a start. The next morning, I faced both Ethan and Grace at the kitchen table in the house. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching me warily as I addressed the kids. "This family isn't broken because I'm leaving," I said, my tone steady. "It was already breaking, and none of us wanted to admit it." Ethan crossed his arms, his scowl deepening, but I pressed on. "I wasn't always the husband or father I should have been, but we're all responsible for how we move forward. I'm still here for you, both of you, but I can't stay and pretend I'm okay when I'm not." Grace nodded hesitantly, her expression softening, but Ethan stood abruptly, scraping his chair across the floor. "You're just making excuses," he muttered before leaving the room. It wasn't the resolution I wanted, but it was the truth. And that was all I could give them. I had to believe that someday they'd understand. For now, it was enough to take the first step toward healing, even if it hurt like hell. In the days after leaving the house, I kept to myself. My routine at the motel was simple. Wake up, take a walk, pick at whatever breakfast I could stomach, and spend hours staring at my laptop screen, trying to decide what my next move should be. It was lonely, but it was safe. A space where I didn't have to answer questions or deal with the wreckage of my life. And then Clara came back into my world. Clara was an old colleague I hadn't seen in years. We'd worked together on a project back when I still cared about my job, and I'd always admired her sharp mind and easy laugh. We'd run into each other a few weeks ago at a coffee shop. One of those quick, polite exchanges where you promise to catch up but never actually do. Except Clara had meant it. She found me again, this time in a little diner I'd discovered near the motel. I was nursing a coffee that had long since gone cold when her voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Matthew Collins, is that really you?" I looked up, startled, and there she was, her warm smile disarming me in an instant. Clara hadn't changed much. Still the same vibrant energy, still the same knack for making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. "Clara," I said, managing a small smile. "Long time no see." She slid into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What's with the dark circles? You look like you've been through a war." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Something like that." She tilted her head, studying me. "Well, lucky for you, I'm an excellent listener. What's going on?" At first, I hesitated. I wasn't exactly in the mood to spill my guts to someone I hadn't seen in years, but something about Clara's presence felt safe, like she wasn't there to judge, just to be there. So, I told her. Not everything, but enough. Enough for her to understand why I was sitting alone in a diner at 11 a.m. on a weekday, trying to figure out what the hell had happened to my life. When I finished, Clara leaned back in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "you always talked about wanting to write. Did you ever actually do it?" I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "Not really. A few false starts, some half-finished ideas. Life got in the way." She raised an eyebrow. "Life or excuses?" I opened my mouth to respond, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Look, I'm not here to lecture you, Matthew, but I remember how you used to light up when you talked about writing. You've got something to say. Maybe now's the time to say it." Her words stuck with me long after she left. I couldn't remember the last time someone had encouraged me like that, had reminded me of the person I used to be. That night, for the first time in years, I opened my laptop and stared at a blank document. The cursor blinked at me, daring me to start. I wrote a single sentence, then another. And before I knew it, the hours had slipped away, and I had the rough beginnings of a story, a real story. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Clara and I started meeting regularly after that. Sometimes it was for coffee, other times a walk in the park. We didn't always talk about my mess of a life. Sometimes we just reminisced about old times or debated which diner in town had the best pie. But every time we met, I felt a little lighter, a little more like myself. One afternoon, as we sat on a park bench watching the leaves fall, Clara turned to me and said, "You know, you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." I snorted. "Yeah, right." "I'm serious," she said, her tone firm. "Most people would have crumbled under what you're going through. But you're still here, you're still standing, and you're still fighting for something better. That counts for a lot." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time feeling like a failure, like I'd let my marriage fall apart, let my kids down, let myself down. But Clara made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized how much I'd been missing, not just in my relationships, but in myself. Clara reminded me what it felt like to laugh, to dream, to hope for something more. She didn't fix me. She didn't try to. But she gave me space to start fixing myself. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe that maybe I could. The road back to my kids wasn't smooth. If anything, it was like trying to scale a mountain barefoot. Every step forward felt precarious, and one misstep could send everything crumbling again. Ethan and Grace were still adjusting to the separation, and while they didn't always say it outright, I could feel the weight of their emotions every time we talked. Ethan was the hardest to reach. After his outburst at the motel, he stopped answering my calls. It was Sarah who broke the news to me a week later. He'd been caught with a small amount of weed at school, and the principal had called the police. When I picked up the phone that night, I heard words I never thought I'd hear. "Your son has been arrested." The drive to the station was a blur of anger and disappointment, not just in Ethan, but in myself. I kept asking the same questions over and over. How did I let it get this bad? What could I have done differently? By the time I got there, I was less a father and more a storm waiting to erupt. Ethan sat on a cold bench in the holding area, his shoulders hunched and his expression defiant. When he saw me, he didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor, like he was daring me to yell at him. "What the hell were you thinking?" I said, my voice low but sharp. He shrugged. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" I snapped, slamming my palm on the table between us. "You've just landed yourself in jail, Ethan. How is that not a big deal?" He looked up at me then, his eyes blazing with anger. "You don't get it, Dad. You don't care about anything but yourself. You walked out on us." The words hit me harder than I expected, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I didn't walk out on you, Ethan. I walked out of a situation that wasn't healthy. There's a difference." He scoffed, crossing his arms. "Whatever. You're just running away." I took a deep breath, forcing the anger down. "You're angry. I get it. But that doesn't give you a free pass to throw your life away. I'm going to help you, but you're going to face the consequences of this. I'm not going to let you keep making excuses." It was like a dam breaking. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and I started having real conversations. Painful, honest ones that often ended in tears or shouting. But they were conversations we should have had years ago. When he entered rehab, I visited him every weekend. At first, he was distant, but slowly, he started opening up. One afternoon during a family session, he finally looked me in the eye and said, "I was angry at you, Dad, but I see now that you were just trying to help. I don't want to disappoint you anymore." I wanted to tell him he'd never disappointed me, but I knew he needed to say it as much as I needed to hear it. "You're not a disappointment, Ethan," I said, my voice steady. "But you have to believe in yourself as much as I believe in you." Meanwhile, Grace was quietly transforming before my eyes. After our conversation in the motel, she started making small changes, staying home to study instead of going out, helping around the house, even asking me for advice on school projects. She threw herself into her schoolwork, and her grades skyrocketed. One evening, she handed me a brochure for a summer leadership program. "Do you think I can do this?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I looked her straight in the eye. "Grace, you can do anything. You've worked so hard for this. I'm proud of you." Her smile was hesitant but genuine, and I knew in that moment how much it meant for her to hear those words from me. Watching her grow into someone so confident and capable felt like a win, a reminder that no matter how much I'd stumbled as a parent, I hadn't failed entirely. Even Sarah surprised me. She started taking accountability in ways I hadn't expected. She repainted the house, fixed the leaky faucets I'd always meant to get around to, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. She didn't say it outright, but I could see she was trying to rebuild her life, not just for herself, but for the kids. We were far from perfect. Family dinners were still awkward, and Ethan and I still had our moments of tension. But there were glimpses of something better. A fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could figure out how to be a family again. One night, as I was leaving the house after dropping Grace off, I glanced back at Sarah standing in the doorway. She wasn't angry or sad, just tired. "Thanks for coming by," she said softly. "Always," I replied. And for the first time, I meant it. We weren't fixed, not by a long shot. But we were moving forward, and for now, that was enough. The mountain town I chose wasn't glamorous, but that was the point. Durango, Colorado, had a kind of quiet charm that felt like exactly what I needed. It was small but vibrant, a place where strangers waved at you on the street, and the pace of life slowed just enough to let you breathe. I arrived with nothing but a rented cabin, a couple of suitcases, and a laptop full of unfinished stories. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first night in the cabin was surreal. The walls were bare, the furniture was sparse, and the silence was deafening. But it wasn't the kind of silence I'd grown used to back in the house, the heavy, suffocating kind. This was a quieter quiet, one that didn't demand anything from me. I sat by the window watching the snow fall outside, and for the first time in years, I felt unburdened. Not happy, not yet, but lighter somehow. The next morning, I set up a small workspace by the window. A modest desk, a lamp, and my laptop were all I needed. The view was breathtaking. Snow-dusted peaks stretching into the horizon, framed by towering pines. I sat down, opened a blank document, and stared at the blinking cursor. At first, nothing came. My mind was still tangled in the mess I'd left behind, replaying old conversations, old arguments, old wounds. But then I remembered Clara's words. "You've got something to say. Maybe now's the time to say it." So I started typing. It wasn't easy. The words came slowly at first, each sentence feeling like a battle. But the more I wrote, the more the knots in my chest began to loosen. I wasn't writing for anyone else, not for an audience, not for approval. I was writing for me, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the story began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. A reflection of everything I'd been through, of the pain and the healing, the loss and the hope. I joined a local writers group on a whim, and to my surprise, it became one of the best decisions I'd made in a long time. Every week, we'd gather in a cozy bookstore downtown, sharing stories and feedback over coffee and pastries. It was humbling and inspiring to be surrounded by people who understood the struggle of putting words on a page, and the joy that came with it. The cabin started to feel like home. I hung up a few pictures of Ethan and Grace, framed a couple of sketches I'd found at a local art fair, and even adopted a scruffy old dog named Max who'd been lingering at the animal shelter for far too long. He wasn't much of a guard dog, but he was good company, always wagging his tail and nudging me for attention when I got too lost in my writing. The town itself welcomed me in small, quiet ways. The barista at the coffee shop learned my name. The clerk at the hardware store asked about my fixer-upper projects. I even struck up a friendship with my neighbor, a retired carpenter who offered to help me build a better bookshelf after seeing my flimsy attempt. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something, not just a town, but a life. Of course, the past didn't disappear. There were nights when I'd sit by the fire, staring into the flames, and think about Sarah, about the life we'd built and the ways it had crumbled. I thought about Ethan and Grace, wondering if they were okay, if they'd forgiven me yet. The memories didn't hurt as much as they used to, but they still lingered, like shadows on the edges of my new life. But then, there were the moments of clarity. The mornings when I'd wake up to the sound of birds outside my window and feel genuinely grateful to be alive. The afternoons when I'd lose myself in my writing, the words flowing like they hadn't in years. The evenings when I'd sit on the porch with Max, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, and realize I didn't feel broken anymore. This wasn't a fresh start. It was a continuation. A new chapter in a story that was still being written. The pain, the mistakes, the failures, They were all part of it, woven into the fabric of who I was. But they didn't define me. Not anymore.